When people talk about Jeffrey Epstein's wealth, they often focus on the billions he moved or the billionaires he worked for. But the real story isn't just about money, it's about geography. Because Epstein's financial power didn't come only from the clients he served or the deals he structured, it came from where he placed the money. In modern finance, location can be more powerful than investment skill, and Epstein understood something that most ordinary investors never realize. The richest fortunes in the world are not protected by markets, they are protected by jurisdictions. By the mid-1990s, Epstein had already secured relationships with ultra-wealthy clients and built a reputation as someone who could quietly restructure fortunes. But he knew that controlling money inside the United States came with limits. Taxes were high, regulators were present, and financial records were easier to trace. For someone whose business model depended on privacy and long-term asset preservation, this environment was far from ideal. So Epstein began shifting key parts of his operation into a place that offered the best of both worlds, the U.S. Virgin Islands. To the average person, the U.S. Virgin Islands looks like a tropical tourist destination, but to global wealth managers, it functions as a financial hybrid. It operates under U.S. jurisdiction, meaning companies based there can still access American banks and legal protections. At the same time, it offers major tax incentives and corporate flexibility that resemble offshore havens. This combination is incredibly attractive to the ultra-rich. It provides legitimacy on paper and discretion in practice. Epstein didn't just move there for lifestyle reasons. He moved there because the territory itself could become a tool in his financial architecture. Epstein relocated his financial entities to the islands and structured them in ways that dramatically reduced tax exposure. By basing his companies there, he was able to benefit from programs designed to attract investment capital to the territory. These programs allowed qualifying businesses to slash their federal tax burden, in some cases by up to 90%. For someone handling hundreds of millions in fees and investment returns, the impact was enormous. The difference wasn't a small percentage, it was hundreds of millions of dollars that would otherwise have gone to the US Treasury. Instead, it stayed inside Epstein's financial system. But tax reduction was only part of the strategy. Offshore structures aren't just about paying less tax, they're about creating layers between the money and the person who owns it. Epstein's companies functioned as buffers. Funds could be routed through corporate entities, trusts, and financial vehicles that made tracing ownership more complex. This didn't necessarily mean anything illegal was happening. In fact, much of offshore finance operates entirely within legal frameworks. But it does mean that visibility decreases, and in elite wealth circles, reduced visibility is considered a feature, not a flaw. Another advantage of operating from the Virgin Islands was regulatory distance. Financial oversight still existed, but it was less immediate than on mainland US soil. For wealth managers, this creates breathing room. Transactions can move through structures with fewer public disclosures, and companies can maintain a lower profile while still interacting with major banks. Epstein leveraged this environment to maintain relationships with large financial institutions while keeping the core of his operation physically removed from the financial spotlight of New York or Washington. This geographic positioning also changed the psychology of his clients. When wealth is managed through offshore structures, it feels more insulated from domestic political changes, lawsuits, or tax reforms. Billionaires often think in terms of decades, not quarters. They want systems that will remain stable even if governments change policies or markets shift direction. Epstein presented the U.S. Virgin Islands structure as exactly that kind of system, a long-term shield around their assets. Whether he always delivered on that promise is debatable, but the appeal of the model was undeniable. One of the lesser-known truths about offshore finance is that it's not just used to hide wealth, it's used to centralize it. Epstein's setup allowed him to bring multiple financial activities under one umbrella. Investment flows, consulting fees, trust arrangements, and corporate holdings could all pass through interconnected entities. This created a private financial ecosystem that he effectively controlled. Instead of money moving directly between client and bank, it often moved through Epstein's network first. That positioning gave him extraordinary influence. He wasn't just advising on wealth, he was sitting in the middle of its movement. Banks tolerated this structure for a simple reason: access to wealthy clients is extremely valuable. Financial institutions compete aggressively for billionaire relationships because those relationships bring massive deposits, lending opportunities, and investment activity. When a wealth manager becomes the gatekeeper to those clients, banks tend to accommodate the arrangement. Epstein's offshore base didn't isolate him from the banking world, it made him a more important node inside it. He could offer institutions a pathway to elite money while maintaining the privacy his clients expected. There's also a strategic reason why offshore financial centers often work best when they remain tied to major economies. Completely independent tax havens sometimes struggle with credibility, but the US Virgin Islands' link to the United States gave Epstein's system an appearance of legitimacy. Transactions routed through his companies were still connected to the US banking framework. That reassured clients and institutions alike. It created the impression of stability as the structure itself provided significant financial advantages. Over time, this offshore model became central to Epstein's identity as a wealth manager. He wasn't presenting himself as someone who could beat the stock market. He was presenting himself as someone who could build environments where wealth naturally grew and remained protected. That's a different kind of financial service entirely. It's less about predicting economic trends and more about engineering conditions where fortunes can survive anything from tax changes to lawsuits to market crashes. This strategy also reveals a broader pattern in global finance. The ultra-rich rarely keep the bulk of their assets in the same places ordinary investors do. They diversify across jurisdictions, legal systems, and corporate structures. Epstein didn't invent this approach, but he packaged it in a way that made himself indispensable. If a client's wealth depended on the offshore architecture he built, removing him from the picture would be complicated. The structure itself reinforced his importance. Another effect of this setup was time. Offshore financial arrangements tend to move slower, with longer planning horizons and more complex paperwork. That slowness can actually be beneficial. It reduces impulsive decisions and makes rapid asset seizures more difficult. For Epstein, it also meant that once funds entered his system, they tended to stay there. The architecture encouraged continuity. Wealth managers who can create systems where money rarely leaves gain long-term control over financial flows, and that control often matters more than short-term profit. Critics later argued that offshore structures like Epstein's allow the wealthy to escape obligations that ordinary taxpayers cannot avoid. Supporters counter that these systems exist because governments created them to attract capital in the first place. Both views contain some truth. Offshore finance operates in the gray space between national interests and global mobility of money. Epstein understood that gray space better than most. He recognized that in a world where money moves freely across borders, the smartest strategy isn't just choosing investments, it's choosing the right legal environment for those investments to live in. By the time scrutiny around him intensified years later, Epstein's financial architecture had already done its job. Large portions of his wealth were embedded in structures designed for durability. The offshore system didn't just increase his earnings, it insulated them. And that insulation is the real reason offshore finance remains so powerful. It doesn't guarantee secrecy forever, and it doesn't make anyone immune from investigation, but it does buy time, complexity, and distance, three things that are incredibly valuable when fortunes are at stake. In the end, the story of Epstein's offshore empire isn't just about one man's strategy, it's about how modern wealth operates at the highest levels. Money doesn't simply sit in accounts anymore. It lives inside networks of jurisdictions, trusts, and corporate entities that stretch across borders. Epstein understood that architecture earlier than most, and he used it to transform himself from a financial advisor into something closer to a system designer. That's why his offshore base mattered so much. It wasn't just a tax move, it was the foundation of his entire financial identity. And it shows that in today's global economy, the question isn't only how much money someone has. The more important question is where that money lives, because the right location can make even enormous fortunes feel almost untouchable.